Hello everybody, welcome to our third podcast, the PodSteiner podcast. I'm Eva Lemmi, teacher of technology.
And I'm Lorène Laire, one of the English teachers of the school.
Today we have a special guest. He teaches at the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. And so let's warmly welcome him, Mr. Dr. Niel Boland. Hello, Mr. Boland.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, we are happy too. So let's start by introducing you to our audience. For those who may not know you, could you please give us a brief background?
My original training is as a musician, but then I started teaching in early childhood when I was living in Japan, and in the first Waldorf kindergarten in Japan, and I discovered how much I enjoyed working with children. I then trained as a class teacher in New Zealand, took a class through, and then went and taught in a large older school in Germany. Now I work in university in New Zealand.
And you're also a writer. Why did you start writing about education?
Right. I lived away from New Zealand for 14 years, and when I went back I found that many things had changed. Those of you who have lived in different places, you know that when you leave a country, the country keeps on changing, keeps on developing, and you also keep on developing, but you often develop in different ways. So when I went back to New Zealand, it was very familiar, but it had moved in different ways from me, and I then had to look at how was that. And as I went into Steiner schools around the country, the changes which I found within Greater New Zealand society, within how things worked, I did not see reflected in the schools so much. And that then led me to have initial questions. Actually, why is this? I was teaching outside the Waldorf movement, and the university was moving along and talking significantly about Indigenous representation and Indigenous rights in ways which I didn't see reflected in Waldorf schools. And this started to give me questions of, well, actually, how is this? Why are we looking at this in one place and not looking at it in another? So I first of all went through at least a couple of years of just thinking, looking and thinking. And then I started talking to people, because you talk to people, you go into schools, you ask questions, and then because of my job as an academic, it is my job to write. It is my job to ask questions, possibly the kind of questions that aren't always asked. And then, so I was thinking, I was talking to people, and then I started writing. And writing is, for me, a way of actually trying to put my thoughts in order. And it's always quite a process. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's quite hard. And by the time I've finished something and sent it off, of course, my thoughts have moved on again. So everything you see is kind of where you read is where I have been, and I'm now kind of working towards the next thing. But the opportunity to have the time to actually sit and think and write is something I value very strongly. And if anything that I write resonates with anybody else anywhere, then so much the better. But it is, for me, a very reflective process that I do it for me to understand my own thoughts better.
I would really like to know a little bit more about your research into place-centered curriculum. So could you explain a little bit more about this concept, and what skills can our students develop by integrating this approach that will be valuable in their adulthood?
I think one of the things which is really important, which is vital in any kind of education, is that certain connections are made during early childhood, younger childhood. The first one, I think, is that children form connections with their own bodies. They actually have to find out what and where their bodies are, how they work. And then the next ring, as you go outwards, is then forming connection to the people immediately around you. And then after that, I think you start forming a connection to your location where you are. You start forming a connection to the ground that you step on, to the plants which are around you, to the birds, to the animals, butterflies and so on. And I think those initial connections are vitally important. And I think they're also reflected in schools. And the ideal of place-based education is that, as it were, what is outside the school, what surrounds the school, in this instance Brazil, how is that reflected inside the school? No? Is it actually teaching people this is where on the earth your feet are? I really feel centered here, and that everything which happens in school actually strengthens that, that you can feel yourself in this kind of continuum of over tens of thousands of years. Where do I fit within this Brazilian history? As if you think of tens of thousands of years of Brazil's nature, where do I or my family, where do I appear? How do I belong here rather than somewhere else? And how can education work to strengthen that? Mm-hmm. I think that could be some way to begin to look into the question. Mm-hmm. Research-wise, I worked with the Honolulu Waldorf School, looking at how was their education, how was the education that they offer actually Hawaiian. Now, how much was really representative of living in Hawaii? The stories that they tell, the kind of things on the walls, the school traditions which are celebrated, are they really Hawaiian? Yeah, and they found that some things were, some things weren't, and therefore, what can we begin to do? So
you think education should always be connected to local?
I think people should initially be connected to where they live, and of course then those rings gradually expand. But I think we do need strong connections to wherever it is we happen to live.
And how that would reflect on children development, for instance?
Well, I mean, I think that for me, if you look at these levels of connection, we meet many young people who have unideal connections to their own bodies. No, we certainly know of people who have less than ideal connections to other people. No, as it were, that real connection isn't as strong as it might be. And also, if I look at us as a human race, we don't appear to have a very strong connection to the world that we live in, to the land that we live on. And if we actually valued, if we really respected, if we loved the land that we live on, we wouldn't destroy it. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And I personally wonder how much can be done in earlier childhood to really establish that this is important, this is part of me, I am part of it, and therefore I'm not going to mess it up. Sure. Yeah. And that is nothing to do with Waldorf education, that's just education.
Mm-hmm. And in cultures like ours, like New Zealand and Brazil, we have many different cultures co-living, and our curriculum sometimes is more European-centered. And so we tend to bring other perspectives to the curriculum. And do you think we need to constantly renew our curriculum so that the students can see themselves reflected in the curriculum?
Short answer, yes. And I think it's always worthwhile to continually ask questions, because as soon as you stop asking questions, you kind of become stuck and you don't continue to improve. But the Waldorf education originally came from Europe. It brings with it a lot. I think it brings with it unconsciously a lot of European things, and then of course in distant countries like Brazil or New Zealand, you have to work out, well, what is Waldorf education? What is Europe? And are there things to be teased apart there? But one question which a Maori colleague of mine asked class 6 and 7 students in all the New Zealand schools to complete the sentence, when I walk into my classroom, I know I'm in New Zealand because. And if I then, as it were, change that for here, when I walk into my classroom, I know I'm in Brazil because. Yeah, and how is what happens within the school a reflection of the outer Brazil? Are they as it were the same? Are the cultures, the peoples, the landscape, the nature of Brazil really reflected in the education? Or is the education to some degree, in some ways, still something of an import, which is just brought in and acts like an exotic flower or an exotic tree, just here we are? Or how actually do you begin to work with those kind of ideas? And ideally, for me, the two would actually reflect each other. What is outside is reflected in the school. What is in the school is then reflected outside, both for locale, for place, but also for people. How is any school actually reflecting greater Brazilian society, or even greater Sao Paulo society, or is it? Just actually, how do you work with that?
Sure, you've got a point. Yeah. And in that sense, you think we should, for instance, teach sustainability? How important is it to teach in schools? And if so, how would you effectively do that?
I'm not going to answer the second question because you don't need to hear from me about that. But is it important to teach sustainability? I think it is the most natural fit within Waldorf education. I think it is something which, in my experience, students understand immediately. Because they're in touch with things, and how can you not teach it? It could be that in 1919 Steiner didn't mention we need sustainability classes, but looking at the world now, how can you not involve it in many things? It doesn't have to be a main lesson block or whatever, but surely. Also the United Nations really wants us to do it with the Sustainable Development Goals, which in New Zealand are really coming strongly into education. I imagine in some ways they're coming in Brazil as well. And I think it's something that troubles young people. What can we do? Otherwise you are just left with this, as it were, the world is in a bit of a mess. There's nothing I can do, and you feel helpless, hopeless. And therefore, I think it's really important to feel empowered. In what ways can I do things? What are examples of young people who actually have taken initiative to go and help do things? Those, I think, particularly for high school students, are really impressive because they're of young people more or less the same age or just a couple of years older who are trying to change the world for the better, and what better example to bring into education than people like Greta Thunberg, from Sweden, who just went and was just a 16-year-old sitting outside, refusing to go to school outside the parliament, and she caused this worldwide revolution, really. And those, I think, are meaningful examples to young people that we can actually do something here. So important.
And as you said, if we start with helping the students to see their local environment, it's easier for them to make a change when they...
Yes, and even just how they can look after their own environment. How can they look after the environment beyond the school gates? How actually do you come from, I really want to do this, but what can I do? What can I actually do to help change the world? I think for young people that's actually really important.
Yeah. And since we are talking about contemporary issues and also changing a little bit gears, how do you see the use of technology since the improving of the increasing use of technology? Like, how do you see the balance between digital tools and more traditional sensory-based educational practices in Waldorf school?
I think these initial connections, which we really need to make to ourselves, to people around us, to nature, those have to be allowed to be securely formed without input from screens, which I think, they actually disconnect us. If I think of all the problems in the world, they're all to do with various kinds of disconnection, and it's connections that we need. So in early childhood, in the earlier years, I think as in the Waldorf school, screens don't even begin to come into the question because you're still doing other important things you need to establish first. And then if I just skip a bit and I say, well, what do we want at the end of the high school? We certainly want people who are digitally aware, who are able to use these technologies responsibly, who are able to discern how to effectively and positively use technologies, and not almost have technologies use them just to become the victim of screens. We really want that. And then we have this interesting period in the middle between not at all and certainly, and how do you navigate that bit? And just for me personally, I always think, well, no, if you're not quite certain, then just hold off a bit, rather than it gets pulled further and further and further and further down. But you can't, if you leave it too long, the children become impatient, the students become impatient, and they think the school's stupid because they don't allow this, that and the other, and you don't want that either. All schools in New Zealand now have banned cell phones. You may not have, and increasing numbers of countries are actually saying in schools, cell phones are out. What is a healthy way to engage with, particularly with digital media, because it so easily pulls you in, and if you're pulled in before you're mature enough to be able to withstand that, is that what you want? But I'm not the person to talk, really to talk about that. But I think those are the kind of questions that you need to be looking at.
That was wonderful, yeah. What do you think is the role of Waldorf pedagogy in contemporary society, especially aimed growing digitalization and globalization?
I think there are many ways of educating, certainly not only Waldorf, and I have here to speak from a New Zealand context, because I cannot speak from a Brazilian one, that the direction which state, as it were, normal education is going in is in some ways really valuable and really interesting. But if I try to imagine that as a holistic education, is the whole human being addressed, and now is head, heart and hands, thinking, feeling, willing. That is not the case. It's very much, particularly once you get to high school, it is only the head which is being addressed, and that I think leads to a one-sidedness and also an undervaluing of the students who have other real gifts which might not be academic, but it's the academic things that count. And so certain people are privileged because they are able to produce the goods academically, and others are told, well, no, actually you don't make the grade. But it also works the other way, that when I was a class teacher, I had a child in my class who was intellectually beyond gifted. He was incredibly clever. And he was in Waldorf school to make sure that it was not only his head that got demanded of. Because that he was going to do anyway. He's now an astrophysicist. But that actually there were other strengths which he needed to build on. And how can we become full, balanced human beings, and particularly not only address things with our heads? Because that, for me, in some state educations, we like testing people, and it's so easy testing knowledge in that way, and what we test is then what we value. And so I think there is an important place for alternative ways of education.
And so music would be a way of doing that, in your opinion?
Yes. I mean, I think in any school, also in Waldorf schools, there is a hierarchy of subjects, and normally it's literacy and numeracy which come at the top, and then science comes quite soon afterwards, maybe history, geography in the middle somewhere, and do you know what you likely can guess what's at the bottom, which is normally the arts. And even within the arts there's a hierarchy. That music is kind of okay, and then we have the visual arts, and then we have drama, and normally right at the bottom we have dance. And students pick up that hierarchy. I mean, I was told repeatedly, no, I should not do music. I would never be able to do anything. It was useless. No, just go and do chemistry. You'll get a job. But what I really wanted to do was music. But you get all these kind of messages. Hopefully not quite so much in a Waldorf school, that it's the more academic things which are superior subjects. And I think for those who have an interest, who have a gift in the subjects which are lower down the hierarchy, that can be quite painful. I mean, I've talked to many people who wish they'd followed what they wanted to do, and possibly do when they're 40, but they've spent 20 years in the middle doing something they hated. And can we do education better? Which I think we always can.
So here in school, and I think in many Waldorf schools as well, we tend to work with projects. So this way we can mix all the subjects.
Which is great.
And so try to fight against this hierarchy. So do you think would be a good way of
I think that's an excellent way.
Fighting this.
And also that, say in high school, you don't teach in siloed blocks. Now we're having a history main lesson, and it's that actually the subjects begin to go together, because in life, of course, they go together the entire time. And I think it's really great when the subjects can become integrated, even being taught by multiple teachers, coming into the same main lesson block, to teach in more innovative, more contemporary ways, and not, as it were, just following the footsteps in the snow. That isn't a very Brazilian image, but.
And so, how studying piano changed your journey?
I think when you study anything to a significant extent, it really becomes, as well as just being able to do complicated things with your fingers, it actually becomes an inner journey. And that, I think, is the important part of any training, that actually there's an outward facility to be able to do things, but the important thing is what happens inside. And I think if you asked anyone who's done any of the arts, the outer representation is very nice, and hopefully people like it and so on, but actually the change is what happens inside. And for me, that is then the important part. Whether or not I play the piano, I remain changed by it.
How the curriculum could be adapted to our times, considering anthropological times, as said in the 20th century, and the colonial thoughts for our current times. How could we adapt it? Should we?
I think everybody undoubtedly should. There are many ways of looking at this. One possible way is looking at what you want education to do, and rather thinking this is what Waldorf education is. I'm going to try and be a good Waldorf teacher. Think, well, actually, what is the end goal which I would like from education? And if I think in a bigger context, I would like, through education, to make the world a better place. And that's possibly why I still am involved in education, both Waldorf education and also other kinds of education, that within me there's this ideal that I would like the world to be better. And then you have to look at, I suppose you can look at the ways in which the world is not getting better, which is all these disconnections that we're disconnected from the cosmos, we're disconnected from nature, we're disconnected from each other, and ultimately we're disconnected from ourselves, which is a pretty bad one.
And Steiner said something about that, right? About the disconnection that we...
I'm sure he did. He said a tremendous amount. But if I just look, what do I want from education in any context, in any school, any country, is I would like students to feel that they are seen. Yeah? I'd like them to feel that they are respected, that they are acknowledged, that they are seen as important, as where people like me are important. I think that in any context is really, really necessary. And then if you look around at our societies and all the ways that doesn't happen, there are so many people who are discriminated against, not seen as equal, the whole list in any country I can think of. And how can we help counter that in education? How can you make sure that there's no child sitting there who doesn't actually feel that they're represented within their own education? I mean, I was once speaking at a conference in Washington, D.C., and with a Black American colleague on these kind of things. And every morning there was an ex-Waldorf student who came to the front to talk about their Waldorf journey for 15 minutes. And one young woman came up, Chinese American, and she said, I was in Waldorf school from kindergarten to class 12. I loved it. I had a wonderful time. And then she started talking about all the ways in which it wasn't ideal. And one was, in the whole of her education, no one had ever mentioned that a Chinese American did anything, and that she was completely missing within her own education, which I think is, in any context, an actual tragedy. That you're sitting there and somehow you don't count. And so how many people, how many groups are missing? What happens within a school? Is it a representation of what's outside the school? And how might that be? How do students learn to fit into their own societies? Which people are here? Which people are missing? Which people are missing in the student body? Which people are missing in the teaching body? Which people are missing in the trust? Who is there and who is not there? Whose art is on the walls, whose art is not on the walls, whose songs are sung, whose songs are not sung, whose stories are told, whose stories aren't told, whose histories. How do you learn history, for goodness sake? We wrestle with these questions in New Zealand. I'm sure you wrestle with them in Brazil too. But just as it were, this is how it goes, this is what we do, I think in the 21st century is no longer good enough. I mean, this young woman in the States, she was speaking to 550 Waldorf teachers saying, you're all good people, you're all trying hard, and it is not good enough. You have to do better. That's a really powerful message. That we might be people of goodwill, but that's actually not enough. How do we want to work even a little bit towards healing the wounds in our societies? because ultimately I really hope that that is what we want to do. And it'd be only a tiny bit, but we can make sure that we're not part of the problem. No? And how, there's lots of people over the decades have written about colonial thinking and how it doesn't only harm the people who are colonized, it also harms the colonizers, because actually what they learn is another form of disconnection. They learn to separate, they learn to disconnect, they learn not to be part of, they learn not to be able to meet people in important ways. And I think that's something that we wouldn't wish on any of our students. But are we doing it regardless? No? And so I think it needs long, hard looks and talks. And above all, for me, it means asking questions of the people you don't ask questions of. No? Whose opinion don't you know, really? Which is normally most. And then ask them, actually, how is it for you? What would help you? And to get alternative voices heard. I mean, I was talking at a congress a couple of days ago, and there was someone who was just saying, when she looked around, that as it were, the European voice was very loud. And worldwide we hear the European voice a lot. It's a loud voice. And so which voices aren't we actually hearing? And do we just need to dial down that European voice a little bit, or quite a lot, in order to let other voices speak, in order to balance the inequalities that we all know of, but because it's how it is, we somehow let it go. And for me, education is the opportunity to begin to address that. I think we know, because no child was ever born who was biased. Children are born completely open, and then they learn their behaviours from us. Yeah? So how can we actually be, in that way, part of the solution? Am I actually able to create spaces? I see myself much more as a space maker, an open space in which something can happen. Yeah, and how do we create this open space, safe above all, in which we can hear voices we don't normally hear? And how do we make people feel safe enough that they can speak is not a silly question. No? Then I think once that dialogue, once that polylogue has begun to move, I mean, you don't even have the questions yet. You have to find out what the questions are. I mean, and it might be me, but I find it takes years for me to get a good question. And then you keep on going with the question gives you other questions. And if you keep on going with the questions enough, eventually you get something like an answer and another 50 questions. No? But how can you actually, as a school, as a society, both the school community and wider society, how can you come into meaningful conversation? And you'll find some people love talking, and some people come with all the answers. We should do this, no? But actually, how can you make space for the people you don't normally hear from? How do you make space for them to feel that in time, it might take ages to be able to speak? And the few occasions in which I've done that, for me, been really, really powerful and really productive, and always come up with things I didn't expect. But that then takes you forwards.
I know you travel a lot, and I would like to know if you have seen good examples of schools that were successful in this task of breaking the cycle of inequality or of...
I think breaking the cycle would likely be ambitious. But if I just speak briefly about what happened in New Zealand, as I said, I went back after 14 years and I was teaching students. I was also teaching students to become Waldorf teachers, and naturally I was also teaching Indigenous New Zealanders, Maori, how to be Waldorf teachers, and they then went and taught in Waldorf schools. And I knew them because I'd been their teacher, and when I went to schools I met them and we said hi and so on. And one day I was sitting with a number of ex-students who are Indigenous, and we were just talking about, well, actually, how is it for you as Maori to work in secondary education? No? And it was a really interesting conversation, one which I hadn't specifically had before. And they said, well, actually, why don't you ask us? Why don't we become your next research project? So that's what I did, and I interviewed them. We were thinking of all the good things about Waldorf education, which we all know, and I won't bother to repeat them because we kind of know them. What was really important was at the end of every... the first important thing was that for everybody... every single person right at the beginning said, thank you for asking us. No one has ever asked us before. And then we had all the good things. And then you came to the, well, actually, do you have anything else to say? And they came with this list of, well, actually, this is what we really think. No, like it wasn't anthroposophy, it wasn't Waldorf education, but working here, this is a Eurocentric atmosphere. We want to work here. We think this is a great school. We think we want to send our children here, but it's actually Eurocentric. It does not value other ways of thinking. It is fond of distributing knowledge, but it doesn't want to learn anything. The one which really got me was disinterested in other people. That one I actually found quite hard. And able to be diverse, able to be different, but hold themselves back. And I then went and spoke. I wrote this up as an article. I found those things so valuable to hear. I wrote it all up, I published it, I spoke to the schools about it. The schools had been trying for 20 years so hard to do something. And they thought they were doing quite well, and they discovered on the feedback that actually they needed to do much better. But then they never asked. And this was, in New Zealand, something of a shock, which really allowed change to happen. Yeah, because often you do need a bit of a push. Yeah, and so they asked a group of Indigenous teachers, please will you go and write a Maori curriculum? Which they did, yeah? And the two were going side by side. And that was a huge step forward. And an aim within that curriculum was that in every class, in every subject, in every year, in every school, I mean just all the time, you would include Indigenous language, you would include Indigenous customs, and you would include Indigenous knowledge in every single lesson. Everybody. Which is a terrific ambition. Yeah? And that was 9 years ago now. And they're still working on it. We make mistakes, of course, all the time. And it needs constant pressure because it's so easy to slip back to how things were because it's comfortable. But how actually can you begin to undo inequalities, basically the consequences of colonization, which exist in all our societies? How through education can we begin to make baby steps and then not be satisfied with baby steps, but just after a baby step, what's the next one? And New Zealand context is undoubtedly different than here. We only have one Indigenous language. I mean, in comparison, so simple.
To make clear to our audience, could you please just give us a scenario of how New Zealand is constituted? Okay,
right. New Zealand was the last big landmass on Earth for human beings to discover. 1,000 years ago, there were no people at all. there were only birds. We also have no native animals. It was just a land of birds. I mean, and birds took the place of animals, so we have enormous birds like, elephant size, but only birds. And then 800 years ago, Maori came in canoes across the Pacific and became the first people living in New Zealand. And 250 years ago, the British came to New Zealand, and 200 years ago, then a lot of people started coming in, which for many countries is not a long time. 200 years is not a great amount of time, but that's how the time period is. It is unusual in New Zealand that the colonizers, the British, they signed a treaty with the indigenous people, basically to respect each other, which, as you know, that was not a normal colonizing approach. You didn't go and sign a treaty. And the treaty is argued about. No one quite agrees, but it is in essence both cultures, both languages, both knowledges, both traditions are equal. We will respect each other. That is unfortunately not what then happened, but it was there. And then now Maori are 18% or something of the population, which is again very different from here. We have significant percentages of people from other places. It used to be quite simple, as it were, Maori and not Maori, which was basically European, predominantly British Irish, and now it's much more mixed. And so Auckland, where I work, is about 50% European, 50% not, of which 25 are Maori Pacific and 25 are from Asia, predominantly China and India. But most children in New Zealand go home and do not speak, in Auckland, go home and do not speak English. Most. So that there really is a lot of diversity coming through. In the indigenous language, Maori is taught in schools. It's really valued. You hear it more and more. You hear it all the time on the TV. And we are going through a process, it appears, of starting to change names, because of course when colonizers come in, they give new names to places which already have names. And so we are in the process of actually going back. I mean, so far as actually deciding what is the name of this country. That when I first moved to New Zealand, it was always New Zealand. And then there was a question, well, it's the traditional Maori names, Aotearoa. And so it was then New Zealand Aotearoa. It's currently Aotearoa New Zealand. And there's a move to actually change it completely and get rid of New Zealand, that it just becomes Aotearoa. And I always used to live in Auckland, but now I live in Tamaki Makaurau, or Auckland, which is the Maori name, and I'm sure in the fullness of time I will just live in Tamaki Makaurau, because and it used to be on the weather forecast you would have both names, but sometimes they only give you the Maori. The weather in so and so will be, and unless you know the name, you don't know what the weather's going to be because you haven't learned it. So that there is a lot of change going on, which not everybody likes, of course. But it makes it very interesting. And it's basically, how can we redistribute, shift power imbalances, which have been out of balance for a long time? How can we begin to negotiate, to work with each other to get things on a more equitable footing, which actually respects everybody and not only certain groups of people? So, tremendous challenge. We make messes all the time, but I think the only thing worse than making a mess is doing nothing. Doing nothing doesn't change anything.
Actually, my final question, I think you already answered, but I can ask you again. I don't
Please.
know. Do you have a final?
I have
Because
some, yeah.
listen to mine and let's see. It was as a final question. What do you see as the future of Waldorf education in a rapidly changing world? I think you might have already answered.
I think what's important is that, and how I understand Waldorf education, is that it's responsive, that it is not fixed. It was not fixed in 1919 and will be the same forever. That actually you respond as a teacher to what is in front of you. You respond to children. And the one wonderful thing about children is they always live in now. Children live now. As adults, we often live in the past, but children never live in the past. They live in now. And also they live in here. I mean, hopefully they don't get trapped in their phones. Sometimes they live in their phones. But otherwise, they live here and now. And I think it's then up to us as teachers to rise to that challenge. Can we teach in here and now? No? And the potential which I see in Waldorf education is huge. But we need always to be addressing the children. If we're not addressing the children, we're talking about some concept in our heads, then I think it isn't going to work so well. But if we really find out what is it to be alive, what does that mean? What does that mean for my teaching? What does that mean for the ways in which I engage with the world, with the children in front of me, and so on, with the subjects I meant to choose, meant to teach? How is that? Then I see the future of Waldorf education as being quite sunny.
Yeah, that's great. Mr. Boland, what would be your dreams? What would you expect from 20 years from now? What would you like to change and see changed in 20 years?
In Waldorf education?
In the world.
Oh, in the world. That is indeed a big question. I think I'm going to have to take my cue from Miss World, no? And where they ask Miss World contestants, what do you want? And the answer is always world peace, no? A bit, because what else can you actually wish for? Yeah? But I do experience the world as majorly disconnected. I experience people as majorly disconnected. Some people more disconnected than others. And I think all those different forms of disconnection, we need to try to connect. Connecting ourselves to the cosmos, connecting ourselves to nature, connecting ourselves to each other, and also then connecting ourselves to ourselves. When you're disconnected from yourself, that is, I think, quite a bad one. Yeah, and I myself think it's then the job of Steiner education plus any other educations. How do you then do that? How can we become an education for connection? And if movements were made in that direction, I would be happy to see. I'd be happy to see them.
Any final thoughts?
Thank you very much for asking me. I didn't come to Brazil thinking that this was going to happen. I didn't even think yesterday that this was going to happen. And it's always nice to be able to talk to people and to be able to unpack or unknot some ideas. All of these are only things which I think about, and I sadly don't have solutions. You don't want solutions, but you need questions.
We are delighted. Thank you so much. And
thanks to our listeners.
And thanks to you for being with us. And so.
And also thanks to the technical crew.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you very much
everybody.
Indeed.
Thank you so much, Niel Boland, for bringing this profound insights into Waldorf education. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed this episode and you found it as enlightening as we did. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and see you next time.